Welcome back to Media 7. As a photojournalist, Jim McMillian's job has frequently been to get himself to the worst places at the worst time. Iraq, New Orleans laid waste by the hurricane, Ground Zero in New York, and the scenes of countless murders in his native Philadelphia. Here's some of his work. Jim now teaches at Columbia University's Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and he believes we don't think enough about how covering traumatic human events affects the journalists who do it. He's with me now. Jim, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, first question has to be, how does a man come to specialise in trauma journalism and being in the worst places?
The truth is that I never decided to. I've thought about it very much, and in fact, while lecturing around New Zealand this week, I've talked about it very much. I'd suggest, if I could suggest a metaphor, it's something like sport. When you're better at something, you're encouraged to do it more and thus become better. And while I like to think that I'm competent at all aspects of photojournalism, sports and features, and even food and fashion, whatever it takes, I was somehow, I could always compete with the best at spot news, and thus found myself doing more of that kind of work, and it kind of snowballs from there.
Is it appropriate to think of as something that you like doing?
I find gratification. I can't say that I enjoy it very much. You feel very good when you've done a good job, when you've written that, photographed that first draft of history and helped people understand important events. But I can't say that I enjoy it very often, no.
So it sounds like, though, there is a philosophy to it. There's a reason you do it.
There are so many reasons. It's an exercise of social conscience very often at home, a sensitivity, a sense of responsibility to history. I like to say after, when I went to Iraq, somebody asked me why I was going to Iraq, and I talked about soldiers often say that they felt a call to duty, that their country needed them. I had the sense that the truth needed me, that it was the right time, it was the right assignment, and that I had a duty to perform.
I presume you've also been in situations where people feel they don't need you there and in fact are hostile to you. How do you deal with that?
I think the most important lesson is to always go in with an open mind and never try to anticipate the reaction. I've shown a lot of photos while visiting universities this week, and I show one police funeral where I expected some hostility when the mother of the people in the photo called me. The widow and children are grieving, and the mother called and said, "I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough. It brought out so much support, distant relatives and old friends." At the same time, the next slide I show is a car accident, very routine coverage, where a family in a neighborhood went on a crusade against me because they were angry at the world. They had lost this wonderful young woman and they needed somebody to blame. So my lesson is that to never take that last experience to the next one and to always strive to keep an open mind.
Now, the other thing you've talked about is the unspoken impact on journalists of covering these events. And this happened to you, didn't it? You had trouble after the Ground Zero photos.
Absolutely, and some have more trouble than me, of course. In a nutshell, all these things that I've covered, whether it's war or terrorist attacks or even just local crime, the crime beat back in Philadelphia, these events that we in journalism call spot news or breaking news are known in the healthcare community as traumatic events. And when they talk about psychological trauma, we understand that psychological trauma has both physical and psychological ramifications for those who experience it over a long haul. The American Psychological Association deemed us, journalists, as first responders a few years ago. In other words, the people who go in when everybody else is coming out. All of those other groups, police, fire, military, medical, forgive me if I'm forgetting anybody, but they have trauma education going in, trauma support coming out. But traditionally, somehow, journalists have thought we're uniquely impervious, we're above it all, we're unaffected because we're supposed to be objective. But we are affected. In my case, Ground Zero was very much my psychological Waterloo. It was more than I could handle. The ground, walking on the ground where 3,000 people had just been killed, it had a lot of meaning for me. And yet, the symptoms for me were relatively mild. well compared to others. I had a sleep disruption for a year and a half, sleeping 1.5 or 2 hours a night, and that led to problems with memory, concentration, articulation. Yet I've met other journalists with much more severe problems. I went to a support group for Ground Zero journalists, launched by the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, where I met people who had not only witnessed what I witnessed, but had also arrived earlier. I would come from Philadelphia. New York journalists arrived earlier and had to run for their lives. Two photojournalists were killed. Others were gravely wounded, but many ran for their lives. That experience left people with other complications, phobias and fears. And I heard one woman explaining to colleagues at the support group that she was celebrating a while later, that she was having many fewer panic attacks than she used to.
And yet this is not the way that journalists talk about these things. More often than not, having seen terrible things is worn as a badge, isn't it?
Well, I would argue that it's still a badge to survive these traumatic events and come out the other end and to be a better journalist. I like to point out that trauma isn't having a traumatic reaction to a traumatic having a clinical reaction to a traumatic event isn't the sign of a weak mind, but the way that a normal, compassionate mind responds to extraordinary experiences. And we've practiced this craft of denial and self-bravado, pretending we're not affected, attempting to be more objective. But I would argue that considering our feelings, considering the way the trauma is affecting us and the people that we report on, will bring us closer to the truth and, in a way, closer to objectivity.
Now, the Ground Zero photos, I was quite fascinated because the first time I saw them, I didn't actually think I was looking at photographs. I thought I was looking at screen grabs from one of the post-apocalyptic video games that my son plays. They looked like that. They looked ethereal. Were you conscious of that at the time of taking those pictures, thinking, this looks amazing?
I could go on all day. It was a 14-hour journey from Philadelphia to New York. It's usually an hour and a half, but with all the roadblocks and all of the impediments and all the threats, all of the interrupted transportation, it took 14 hours. When I arrived there, I learned I didn't have the language before I studied trauma, but I learned that I even went into somewhat of a dissociative state, denying what I was seeing. I couldn't believe that I was there. I remember I hadn't seen this imagery before. When I left my home in Philadelphia, planes had hit the buildings. I hadn't seen the result of the collapses. And I didn't know what to expect. And I had part of me refused to comprehend it. And I saw other people in many other states of psychological distress there. I saw one man just paralyzed who didn't move all night. I had a firefighter walk up to me, and he needed to tell me the names of everybody who knew who died, captain this and deputy commissioner that. And everybody was profoundly affected. So there was nothing normal about the experience whatsoever. It was just beyond belief, of course.
Are there photos that you shouldn't take or merely photos that you shouldn't publish?
I think both are true, but there are no hard and fast rules. One example I've talked a lot about this week is early in my career, before I had any idea how these things might affect me, I went to a Christmas Eve fire where 3 children and a babysitter were killed, and photographed the mother. And as she got the news, because she was returning from Christmas shopping with a Santa Claus hat and bags of gifts. It was horrible. And I regret, and a newspaper reporter in the Sunday Star Times asked me how I felt about this years later, because he heard a previous presentation. And I said, you know, I feel apologetic. I feel almost kind of dirty for taking this photograph, for intruding in this horrible moment, making it a little bit worse. At the same time, in hindsight, now that I've learned about trauma, I feel a little bit angry as a young journalist that I was put into that situation with no expectation of what I might witness, how I might feel about it, how I might react, and what my responsibilities were. And thirdly, I feel truly very fortunate at this point in my career that I can garner a little bit of an audience and talk about those things for the benefit of young journalists who might face them next.
We also live in a world now where not everyone on the scene of something like that who has a camera is a professional. We live in a world where everyone carries a camera around in their pocket and their cell phone. How is that changing things?
Oh, in terms of, it's changing everything, of course. In terms of trauma, I'm terribly concerned. And we at the Dart Center talk about how we're going to reach out to citizen journalists, independent journalists, and we haven't really, as far as I know, I haven't been a party to formulating any sort of plan so far. But the threats are more complicated because they have less of an expectation of what they might face, what their moral and ethical responsibilities are. And we know that trauma symptoms, like I said, they can have physical and psychological ramifications, and that the wrong sort of treatment by journalists can exacerbate those symptoms for the sufferers. So there's a potential for great harm and a responsibility for us to reach out and educate them, but it's going to be even more difficult now.
But you don't think that they're a bad thing per se? Because surely if news is where the journalists are, and if you have journalists everywhere, then you capture all the news.
Yeah, if you believe in free press, everybody's a journalist. You know, the sole pamphleteer has the same rights as the established award-winning journalist, and I believe that very strongly. So I believe that the next step isn't restraining them, but educating them.
Well, Jim McMillian, thank you for coming in, and I hope you enjoy your time in New Zealand.
It's an incredible country. You live in a paradise. Thanks so much.
Yes. And that is our show for this week. Thank you to all those who've joined me: Bridget Saunders, Mike Valentine, Duncan Garner, Amanda Miller and Jim Tully, and again to Jim McMillian. And thanks to you for watching. We'll be back with Media 7 at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.